The readings stopped making sense 3 hours before the eclipse. That was the first sign, and Dr. Maren Solis almost missed it. She was elbow deep in the equipment housing of Survey Unit Kappa 7, a battered magnetic resonance rig that had been dropped onto this rock. Officially designated Kepler 882c, informally called the slab by every human who'd ever touched it, from a relay drone that the consortium had not bothered to name. The slab earned its nickname, flat, grey-brown, devoid of anything resembling softness. The sky above it was the color of old teeth. 2 moons hung at the horizon, one pale and close, the other so distant it looked like a nail hole punched through the clouds. Maren. Her partner's voice crackled in her earpiece. Come look at the gradient. Tomas Vega was 100 meters away, crouched beside the secondary array they'd staked out along the magnetic seam. He had the kind of patience that came from 20 years in field geophysics, the ability to sit very still and watch numbers change, and find that interesting. Maren had always envied it. She herself found stillness difficult, which was probably why she was the one perpetually fighting the Kappa 7's corroded port seals. She sealed the housing, clicked her multi-tool back onto her belt, and walked toward him. The gravity here was 82% standard, just enough to fool your body into moving faster than was probably wise. The ground had a faint shimmer to it in the afternoon light. Not from heat, the slab didn't do heat, but from the magnetic field that ran through its substrate like a slow electric current. That field was why they were here. The consortium's survey contracts ran 6 pages of legal text and 1 page of instructions, and the relevant instruction was, measure the flux. She crouched beside Tomas and looked at the readout. The gradient was doing something it shouldn't. Tell me that's instrument error, she said. I've run the calibration 4 times. She studied the numbers. The magnetic field in this region ran northeast at roughly 15 microtesla. Not remarkable, well within parameters she'd seen on a dozen similar bodies. But the flux gradient, the rate of change across the lateral axis of the seam, was shifting, not randomly. Shifting with a slow, deliberate increase, like something underground was waking up and stretching. Could be tidal, she said. Maybe. Tomas pointed at the readout's timestamp. Started about 6 hours ago, steady climb, he paused. Both moons are in conjunction tonight. Maren sat back on her heels, lunar eclipse. The secondary moon passing into the shadow of the primary. A local event the survey briefing had mentioned in passing as something that happened every 842 standard days. Not worth noting, the briefing said. Interesting for atmospheric optics, otherwise inert. The consortium's planetary geologists, she thought, were sometimes careless with the word otherwise. She pulled out her handheld and began running projections against the timing. The gradient increase correlated almost perfectly with the alignment, which meant the moons weren't just blocking each other's light. They were doing something to the field. How high does it go? She asked. At current rate. Tomas looked at the sky. Peaks about minutes after totality, which is, he checked his tablet, 3 hours from now. What's the peak value? He told her. Maren was quiet for a moment. She was not, professionally speaking, the kind of person who catastrophized. She had spent a career making careful, incremental assessments. But there was a number above which the magnetic flux on a body like this stopped being interesting geological data and started being a navigational and biological hazard, and the number Tomas had just given her was above that number. We need to pull in the secondary array, she said. All the sensors we can recover. Get them inside the shelter. Tomas looked at her with the expression of a man who had worked with her long enough to know when she was being methodical versus when she was being actually worried. He stood up without further discussion and began pulling the first sensor stake. That was the thing about fieldwork partners. You didn't have to explain everything. They worked quickly. The slab's terrain wasn't cooperative. Shallow cracks in the basalt ran in every direction, and the sensor cables had a habit of snagging in them. But 20 years between them meant a rhythm that didn't need coordination out loud. Maren coiled cable. Tomas broke down the tripod frames. The sky above them deepened from old-tooth gray to something darker, not blue exactly, more the color of a bruise left too long. 20 minutes into the recovery, the ground hummed. It was subtle. The kind of thing you'd dismiss as equipment vibration if you weren't standing on bare rock, with your hand pressed against a sensor housing. Maren felt it through her gloves and looked at Thomas. He nodded once. He'd felt it too. She checked her handheld. The gradient had jumped. "We're ahead of schedule," she said. They moved faster. The shelter was a standard consortium field unit. Insulated aluminum skin, internal Faraday shielding, rated to 30 microtesla, fold-out airlocks that were exactly as flimsy as they looked. It sat in a shallow depression, 200 meters from the seam, which had seemed like sensible positioning when they'd arrived. Now Maren looked at the 200 meters of open ground between the shelter and their current position and ran a quick mental calculation. The answer was, finish faster. They were 30 meters from the shelter, arms full of coiled sensor cable, when the first arc appeared. It came out of the ground, not like lightning. Lightning was sudden, explosive, gone. This was patient. A line of violet-white light that rose from a crack in the basalt, like something that had been waiting for the right moment and had finally decided the moment had arrived. It climbed 2 meters, 3, then branched, fracturing into a lattice of smaller threads that spread along the surface in every direction. The humming became audible, not loud, almost musical if music were something that resonated in your back teeth rather than your ears. "Inside," Maren said. They ran. She made it to the airlock first, got it open, held it while Thomas threw himself through with the cable still tangled around one arm. She followed. The outer door sealed. The inner door cycled. The sound of the humming dropped immediately, muffled by the Faraday lining, and Maren stood in the shelter's small main space and tried to think clearly. Her handheld still worked inside the shield. She pulled up the external sensors, 3 units they hadn't been able to recover in time, still broadcasting from their stakes in the field. The gradient reading was climbing in real time. The arcs outside were multiplying. Thomas unwrapped himself from the cable. He had a long red mark on his forearm from where the housing edge had caught him, not deep, already fading. He looked at the readout over her shoulder. "Still 3 hours to peak," he said. You think the shelter holds?" Maren thought about the Faraday rating, 30 microtesla. She looked at the projected peak value on her screen. "Depends on the rate of increase." Thomas sat down on one of the equipment cases and pulled out the small silver flask he carried everywhere. She had never asked him what was in it. On field deployments, a person's flask was their own business. He took a sip and offered it to her. She took it. It was something amber and warm and slightly too sweet, which was exactly what she needed without having known she needed it. "First time I've seen planetary magnetics do something actually new," he said, which was the closest Thomas ever came to expressing wonder. "First time I've been inside one," she said. Outside, visible through the shelter's single reinforced viewport, the arcs were beautiful. She had to admit that. The violet-white lattice covered the slab's surface in every direction she could see, pulsing in slow rhythms, the branches reaching and receding, the ground beneath them lit from within like something remembering fire. The 2 moons were climbing toward alignment. She could see the shadow of the primary beginning to touch Tim of the secondary, the eclipse beginning to bite. "Consortium's going to want all the data," Thomas said. "They can have it. Going to be angry we pulled the sensors. They can be angry." He nodded. That was settled. She set up every recording device she had. If they were going to sit in a box on a magnetized rock for the next several hours, she was going to come out of it with the most complete data set any human had ever collected on a phenomenon that, as far as she knew, no human had ever been close enough to record. The 3 external sensors still broadcasting gave her surface field readings. Her handheld's internal sensors gave her interior atmospheric data. She pulled out the seismic unit from the bottom of the equipment crate and calibrated it by hand, which took 7 minutes and required a lot of swearing under her breath at the calibration software, which had a menu structure designed by someone who had clearly never been in the field and needed to calibrate anything quickly. Tomas watched her do it. He didn't offer to help. He knew she needed to be doing something with her hands. "My grandmother used to sing when she was scared," she said, not really to him. "Were you scared?" "I'm not scared." "Right." She finished calibrating the seismometer and set it against the shelter wall. The readout immediately showed something, not earthquake activity, but a deep, regular resonance in the substrate, the body of the slab itself vibrating in sympathy with the field above it, like a bell after being struck, like an instrument being played. She thought about her grandmother, which she hadn't done in a while. The woman had lived her whole life within 40 kilometers of where she was born, had never left the surface of one planet, had sung songs when she cooked in a kitchen that always smelled like dried herbs and machine oil from the garage below. What she would have made of a granddaughter who measured the magnetic fields of rocks that circled stars that didn't have names yet was something Maren had never quite been able to imagine. Something her grandmother had said came back to her now. The ground knows things. She'd meant it about her own garden, about the way certain patches grew certain things better than others without being told to. But standing in a metal box on a world that was singing to itself through its own crust, Maren thought her grandmother had maybe been making a broader point. The eclipse reached totality in the second hour. She watched it through the viewport. The secondary moon slid fully into the primary's shadow, and the sky changed. Not dramatically. There was no sudden darkness, because the star was still up, but the quality of the light shifted, some spectrum of reflection lost, and the slab's surface responded. The arcs intensified, the lattice pulsed faster, brighter, the violet-white deepening toward something almost blue. The humming the Faraday lining had been suppressing found new registers to push through, and for about 40 minutes, the shelter itself was part of the sound. Maren sat on the floor with her back against the equipment crate, headphones in to better hear the seismic data, transcribing observations on her handheld in the methodical, specific way she'd been trained. Tomas sat across from her, doing the same in his own notebook, actual paper, which he insisted on for primary logging. She'd teased him about it for years. Now she thought it might be the smarter move. The peak came without warning, which was to say it arrived exactly when her projections said it would. But projections on paper and actual phenomena in person are different things. The gradient reading on her external sensors spiked hard, the number climbing past every threshold she'd set, the readout briefly going to an error state before resolving back with a value that she looked at for 3 seconds before accepting it as real. The shelter's lights flickered. The Faraday lining held, but she could feel the field pressure against the hull. Not physically, not quite, but in the way you feel a subsonic bass note in a room with good acoustics present in the body more than the ears. All of her recording devices continued to function. She checked them one by one, everything running, everything capturing. Outside, the slab was incandescent. The lattice had become a sheet, the individual arcs merged into a continuous surface plasma that covered every centimeter of the exposed terrain she could see. It moved in slow, sweeping patterns, not random, organized, directional, like currents in water, like weather. The 2 moons stacked in their rare alignment were invisible through it. The light the plasma gave off was enough to see by, blue, violet, and steady, and it turned everything, the gray, brown basalt, the survey equipment stakes they hadn't been able to recover, the shelter's shadow, into something out of a dream about a planet that had been alive once and still remembered it. Tomas set down his notebook. He stood up and looked through the viewport. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. After a while, Maren got up and stood beside him. The peak held for 11 minutes. She timed it. 11 minutes of a dead world conducting itself, the field threading through every crack and plane of its surface, the eclipse holding the alignment that made it possible. Then the secondary moon began to emerge from shadow, a bright crescent reappearing at its leading edge, and the gradient began to fall, and the plasma dimmed in slow degrees, the sheet breaking back into lattice, the lattice thinning into arcs, the arcs fading into the ordinary shimmer that passed for nothing remarkable on the slab on any other day. When it was over, fully over, the field back near baseline, the sky back to its familiar bruised gray, Marin ran a system check on every device she'd had running. Everything had captured. Nothing had failed. Huh, she said. Tossa retrieved the flask. They shared it again. The outer airlock cycled open without complaint. Outside, the slab was exactly as it had been when they'd run inside. The basalt gray-brown and cracked, the shallow depressions full of nothing, the sensor stakes they hadn't recovered, still standing at their angles, apparently unharmed. The field was at baseline, the moons had separated. The sky was lightening toward whatever passed for evening on this rock. She walked out to the stakes and checked the sensors. All three had continued recording through the peak. Their data would fill in the gaps her internal readings couldn't reach. She stood in the middle of the survey field for a moment and looked at the ground. Nothing visible, no trace of what the slab had been an hour ago. But the seismometer data, still running on her handheld, showed the deep resonance hadn't fully dissipated. It was down to a murmur. Still there, somewhere below her feet, the slow echo of the thing they'd seen. Thomas came up beside her. He had his notebook in one hand. "How long until the next eclipse?" she asked. 842 standard days. She looked at the ground for another moment. Then she looked up at the two moons, separated now and drifting in their separate paths, neither one paying the other any attention. "I want to be here for it," she said. Thomas considered this. It was, by any measure, an impractical statement. Field deployments were 6 months. The consortium scheduled surveys on cost efficiency, not scientific interest. 842 days was a long time to argue a budget line. "You'll have the data," he said. "That's a strong argument. I want both." He put the notebook in his pocket. "Then we make both arguments." She started walking back toward the shelter to begin the data pull. Behind her, the ground's faint shimmer caught the last of the filtered starlight. Ordinary, now, just the baseline field doing what it had always done, and made the surface look, briefly, like the skin of something breathing. She noticed. She didn't say it. Some things you write down later when you have the language for them. The consortium received the survey data 48 days after Marin transmitted it. It moved through 3 departments before reaching the geophysics desk, where it sat for a further 6 days before a junior analyst ran the numbers and went very still in his chair. He filed the report upward that same afternoon. The report used careful language, the language of someone who wanted to be accurate and also did not want to be laughed at. It described the magnetic resonance phenomenon. It attached the data logs. It noted, in a subordinate clause near the end of the 3rd page, that the energy output observed during peak totality was sufficient, if appropriately harnessed, to power a survey station continuously for approximately 400 standard years. The report did not generate immediate action. Reports rarely do, but it generated a flag, and the flag generated a secondary review, and the secondary review generated a meeting at which several people who were not geophysicists sat around a table and looked at numbers they didn't fully understand and began, slowly, to understand that the dead grey rock in the Kepler 882 system was not dead. Marin was 3 months into her next deployment on a basalt shelf in the outer reaches of a different system altogether, when the consortium reached her with the new contract offer. She read it sitting on a rock in roughly 20% gravity, the kind of gravity that made every movement feel like the beginning of flight. The contract was specific. It named the date of the next alignment. It named the position and type of the installation they wanted built. It named a budget that was, by consortium standards, serious. It also contained, buried in the appendix in the dry language of logistics planning, a note from the junior analyst who'd flagged her original report. He wasn't authorized to send personal notes through contract channels. He'd done it anyway. It said, "I ran your data 17 times. I wanted you to know someone read it." She read the note twice. Then she sent back her signature on the contract added a short line of her own to the acceptance memo, and went back to work. Her short line said, "I'll need my partner." When she told Tomas over an encrypted channel, his voice carrying the particular quality of someone trying not to sound excited and failing, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll need a new notebook. Bring two," she said. She looked up at the star she was currently working under, a yellow-white dwarf that didn't have a proper name, just a catalog number and a set of coordinates. Small star, unremarkable at distance. The kind of thing the consortium mapped and moved on from. But underneath her right now, she could feel the familiar baseline hum of a world that was itself. Not dead, not inert. Just waiting for someone to listen at the right frequency. She had decided, somewhere in the 11 minutes of totality on the slab, constitutionally incapable of not listening. 842 days. She'd been in worse situations with less to look forward to. She picked up her multi-tool, unsealed the equipment housing, and went back to work.